When I first studied to be a pastor, that was my first academic effort, was to become a pastor. I wanted to save the world. Nothing ambitious, just saving the world, you know. And I was taught that my job would be to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. So as a therapist, I finished my BA in theology and biblical languages, went to seminary and got a Master of Divinity, and then found that working within the organization I had studied to work with, that they didn't like questions a whole lot. I was challenging some of the ways we did things, not the theology, but how we practiced it. And that wasn't appreciated. And I thought, you know, I could end up being a pastor, not a Christian. And I'd seen quite a number. You know, they were burnt out, they were pulling a paycheck. And it's like, wow, that was a scary prospect. And so I said, well, there's other ways to minister, and I will become a therapist. And so I got my master's in marriage and family therapy. Marriage and family therapy is a newer profession. The psychology had been around, social work had been around. And the effort is looking at the interaction between people. That's what's being studied. And a guy who's made a lot of sense to me, Dr. Murray Bowen, was one of the founders of family systems theory. Very interesting guy, died in 1990. I didn't have the opportunity of actually meeting him. I've met others who worked with Dr. Bowen. He believed that the study of human behavior could be made more factual. That the study of human behavior didn't have to hang its head next to other hard sciences, but it would have to approach it in a different way. That Dr. Freud, when he was doing his look and he saw something intense between a mother and a son, and he called it an Oedipal Complex. He drew from literature. And as soon as he started going there, it was hard to make a science of it. So Dr. Bowen began to say, well, although he was looking at something that we could measure, how he was trying to measure it moved it out of science and into a philosophy. So Dr. Bowen's effort was to stay in the sciences. He grounded his theory in evolution and in the natural sciences. And so it may be a strange place to find somebody who maintains fundamental beliefs. I am a creationist. I would love to be somebody who is in the intelligent design realm. These are people who say, we don't have a preconceived idea. We're not assuming there's no God, and we're not assuming there is one. We're going to look at the evidence and say, where will it lead us? That's a neutral position that I do not have. I just can't get there. But I think that it's a nice one, you know, and the effort to try to see things that way would maybe be useful. So with what I'm going to present today, I'm seeing these various forces involved in the world. There's lots of them, but three major ones that are challenging for dominance of how are we going to govern? How are we going to do things? How are people going to get along? We want harmony. How do we get it? And typically what that means is if you would give up your strongly held beliefs and adopt mine, we would have harmony. You know? It's like, well, who wants to do that? You be first, you know. When I was working as a pastor, I would tell people, I'd sit down and study the Bible with them, and they would say, well, how do we know which religion is right? And in that they were saying, well, which branch of Christianity? Because I wasn't presenting religions, I was presenting Christianity. And they said, well, how do we know which one's right? And I said, you know, you're going to have to make that decision because there isn't a single one out there that says, here's what we believe, we're wrong. You know? They all say they're right. You know, so you have to look at the evidence and say, what makes sense? How do we go about understanding this? And when there is a disconnect between what's being stated, how do they go about dealing with the disconnect? There is nothing that is, because all of these things are human understandings, they're all imperfect. There is no perfect model. There's a lot of imperfect ones. So how do we go about dealing with this in a way that's going to be workable? That religion, as I see it, the whole purpose of it is the conveyance of values from one generation to another. That's the point of it. And there isn't anything else that has worked as effectively as religions to move values from one generation into the next. But then how do we do it? So in looking at what are these ways that are going on, Americanism is one of the forces in the world. This is, Americanism isn't Christianity. Americanism isn't Judaism. That the idea of a Judeo-Christian ethical monotheism is what is behind Americanism. That we all will have to give an account to God one day. God as you understand God to be. Maybe that's where the 12-step and the AA movement is along with that. That you have to define God. That liberty is what motivates in Americanism. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. That to name an American, as it were, based on an ethnicity, you can't do it. Because as soon as somebody adopts American ideals, they are an American. And they can stand next to other Americans. Whereas you'll notice, I don't know how many of you try to become a German or a Frenchman. Go ahead and try. You'll never become one. I can't become one. You could live there a long time and they could treat you very nicely, but you'll never be a Frenchman. Respect for property rights has been something that was huge within the American system, that what is yours. Whereas other countries, not too far from us, we look at the disparity. Why aren't they having more prosperity? Where is the freedom in those countries? Is it lack of resources? And clearly it isn't. Geography? They're not that far away. So what's different? And certainly property rights is something that has made a difference. When you don't know that you can keep what you worked hard for, there becomes insecurity and certainly a lot more polarization, fighting. So here's another, nationalism is part of Americanism. That is part of the deal, that we say that America is exceptional. America isn't exceptional the way that Greeks are exceptional. Okay, that certainly all our, various countries have different origins and what motivates them, how they came about. That, to talk to somebody in Italy about the origins of their country, it's in ancient history, right? If you want to, the Romulus, Remus, raised by the wolf. This is kind of like, wow, this is whereas Americans, you can go to Mount Vernon and look at one of our founders. I mean, it's as though he just walked away. He's coming back. His house is right there the way he left it. That we don't have to go into ancient history to look at who founded our country. We almost rub elbow to elbow with them. This is unique and exceptional. There's a distrust of international courts and tribunals. That's always been the case for Americans. We're willing to cooperate, but we do things our way, and you don't tell us how we're doing things. Okay, that's an American ideal. It sees America as good. That's different than a country saying great. That certainly the Greeks would like to recapture Greek greatness, and the French would like to recapture French greatness. That typically means being stronger than somebody else. That America is great, but it's good, is a belief of Americanism. Now, there's certainly those people who don't believe that. They say, hey, the biggest evil in the world is America. Okay, I disagree with them. And I don't believe that that's an American belief system. That's a European belief system. And it rejects the concept of familialism, meaning that you can get ahead based on your family. That certainly the people who came here said, we're coming here because we're tired of that. We had a number of people who immigrated in the early days of this country who were second-born sons because they knew they couldn't get anywhere because their brother was getting all the property. What do you do as a second-born son? You ask your older brother who has everything for an allowance. That's how you did things in a familial type system. And America was like, hey, you can make yourself whatever you want to be based on your hard work and effort. If you have an idea, that can create for you the kind of lifestyle that you want for your family and your kids and grandkids. Today, we're hearing a lot about redistributing wealth. And based on just looking at how things work, I think it's very short-sighted. A buddy of mine is a financial planner, and financial planners are helping families typically who have quite a bit or those who want to, but financial planners like working with people who have a lot already. They have more to work with. And so somebody did a study of looking at families who had great wealth 100 years ago, saying how many of those families kept their wealth 100 years later. Any thoughts?
Which 100 years? Does this include the Depression?
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
Not very many.
Not very many.
But they all wanted to.
Yeah.
And the Depression for the very wealthy didn't impact the very wealthy that much, frankly. In fact, many of the very wealthy did quite well during the Depression. You know that 75% of the people worked during the Depression, right? Yeah, it's 25% unemployment, 75% employment. I mean, it doesn't mean that it quit, but for those who were unemployed, it was tough. I mean, my mother was a child of the Depression, and I grew up with those waste not, want not values that got passed along. That's just part of what happened. But yeah, 7%. 7% of the families, and I don't think that that is because of the Depression, that the numbers are that low. That's just the way it is. The biggest determinant of where the money went was divorce, frankly. The money goes into the ether. It just goes away. It gets redistributed. So for those who are saying, hey, let's redistribute it now, just give it time. It's going to redistribute. It does that. That's just the way it works, in my estimation. Ooh, I'm going to press this one more time. Oh, there we go. So here's another system that is vying for dominance, Islam. Islam means submission. Submission to the principles of Islam. This is what that's about. So those people who are submitting get along, and those who say, well, I'd just soon not submit, they don't do so hot. I mean, that's within their country or outside of it. I'm not an expert on Islam, so I'm not going to spend a lot. I just have this one slide because I know very little. But from what I've seen and observed, sees America as evil. It's the great Satan. Israel is the little Satan, right? That's the rhetoric of those who stand around chanting. They distrust women. That's a very mild way of saying that what happens toward women. Keep them covered, keep them subservient. There's the scriptures, the Quran is taught as being dictated scriptures. When they're dictated by God, they can't be changed. Okay? That is different than Christian scriptures or Judeo-Christian scriptures. Christians and Jews believe that scriptures were inspired by God but not dictated. And those who said that, oh, these are dictated, are outside of traditional teaching of what the scriptures are. That New Testament, this would be Paul's writings. He said that holy men of God spoke as they were moved, not as they didn't take dictation. And Islam does embrace familialism. So there's this idea of who you know, and part of, in the war over there in Iraq, that as the U.S. was trying to figure out what's going on here, especially in the effort to try to find Saddam Hussein and bring him to justice, they had to understand how did these families work. And once they started breaking that code, it became fairly easy then to find him. That's how that worked. They've just put it on the board and began doing these family charts. Okay, here we go. I'm pressing. There we go. Thank you so much. So here's another movement. Leftism came out of the Enlightenment. There's no creator. When you have no creator or creator God, you're going to go to God substitutes. So Marxism, socialism, fascism, communism, environmentalism, or pacifism become God substitutes. We will save the world rather than God doing it. That is, in my estimation, what starts taking place. Equality is valued over liberty. We're hearing that today. You know, there was a great deal of upset over a movie that, how many of you saw the movie? The Innocence of Islam, or what is that what it was? That one.
Innocence of Islamic.
Yeah. I haven't seen the movie. I missed it. That there's a call to restrict First Amendment rights, right? You need to tell people not to do this. Stop it. And it's in direct conflict with American values. That doesn't mean America values insulting other people.
That's right.
But America values that in a free society, we're going to deal with excesses. That's just the way, that's what comes along with this. And that we change opinion. In this country, we experimented with, can we dictate the value of non-drinking, for instance? And we changed our Constitution. Women were behind that movement. They changed our Constitution when they didn't even have a vote. This is power that women had and that society had with the effort to say, we want to reduce spousal abuse and child abuse. And they saw that correlation going on. And when you hear people say prohibition didn't work, they're not looking at what it was intended to do. It did morph. It became something that it didn't originally start off to do, but we do see the decline of spousal abuse and child abuse during those years. But there were unintended consequences that came along with it. And I've heard people say, well, it unleashed the mafia. You know, oh, that's what started the organized crime in this country. Well, only as much as the car did, and beginning to have interstate highways did. You know, I don't hear people blaming that. But there was an overreach with prohibition. If they had worked to have a restriction on alcohol versus a prohibition, they would have gone further. And we wouldn't have alcohol in every single store you go into, right? I mean, it would have been in limited places and not as easy for people to get. Nationalism is seen as dangerous. Nationalism causes wars. So if we get people to not care, we're all citizens of the world. It would be a that would be more of a leftist view of things, saying that the UN, for instance, that's going to be the thing that saves us. We'll give them more power. We'll have a governing body in The Hague. They'll decide things, international court. Government is seen as the best solution to problems such as poverty or inequality, racism, sexism, homophobia, bigotry, or pollution. These are the answers. So we need bigger government to deal with the problems that still exist. That is not, that I see as different than an American value of saying small government. The least amount of government necessary to have a safe society. And thank you very much. So big government, free healthcare. Well, there is no such thing as free healthcare. And countries around the globe are seeing that there is nothing free. You're just not paying for it at the door, right? The idea that there was insufficient health care in this country is a myth. There's always health care. But there wasn't always insurance. How are we going to pay for it? So the very poor could go into any ER. They're required by law to treat anybody who shows up. We've always had that, right? So there was always health care. But as a society, we're saying, wow, that's pretty expensive health care, you know, to go to the ER. And so then the waits became longer. We're seeing that about a third of the people who show up in an ER just walk away saying, it's not worth this wait. That's one way to restrict how much is being paid on it, but it's kind of a lousy way. So we're still debating this. It's the law of the land now, right? Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act is the law. And yet the campaign is all about whether or not we're going to keep that as a law or not. And as a society, we're going to make a decision in November. That's a big point of the political debate. Guaranteed jobs. Does the government guarantee you work? In France, you do. If you get a job, you can't get fired, right? I mean, that's what some of the riots were a couple years ago. They burnt cars and everything, right? Because I guess it's not a riot unless you burn a car or break a window. I've heard that. I've not been part of enough rioting to really know what the rules are.
It's called solidarity.
Is it? It's called anarchy. In this country, we'd call it anarchy and lawlessness.
Yes.
Guaranteed jobs. What jobs are guaranteed? When the government starts deciding which jobs should be there versus ones that don't, it leads to great inefficiency and a great deal of waste. Governments know how to waste money. That's about all they do, frankly. I mean, that anything the government touches, there's great waste that goes with it. Because to pay for the bureaucracy that is there to either deliver care, whether it's health care or delivering education or delivering anything, that you're paying all this money just for the structure of it, and by the time it trickles down to whoever's supposed to get it, there's very little there. We've seen it in many, many ways. Education, great amounts must be spent. Now, I did put in your group of your handouts. Did you fill out the questionnaire? Did you find it?
Yes.
Okay, did you fill that out?
Yes.
This is just thought-provoking. You don't need to give an answer now. I'm not going to ask for those. But the idea that I did ask a question about that, the U.S. spends more on the military than it does on education. True or false?
False. True.
Who's saying false?
False.
It is false. The U.S. spends 1.5 times more on education than it does on the military. But you have to, not from the federal level. The federal level, it only covers military. But for education, there's the state, there's the county, there's the local that has to be added in. And when you add that all in, far more is spent on education, right? So again, being able to compare compare apples to apples here. And, the left, who doesn't, this idea that who is going to oppose education? Nobody opposes education. How are you going to have a free society if people are uneducated? So both sides, right now, I truly believe we're in the midst of a second American Civil War. We're not shooting each other. We learned that that's a pretty lousy way to settle battles, okay? But it is equally a war, these two sides. And we long for a time when people could go and talk and compromise. And at this point in time, until we get clear on what we're going to do, there is no compromise. You can't have large government and small government at the same time. You're going to do one or the other. Okay, and we're defining ourselves. Are we on a path that's sustainable? There's those who believe it's not. $16 trillion and growing. At what point is there a tipping point and the United States would cease to be able to pay its own bills, would default? What does that mean in the world? When oil is pegged to the dollar, for instance, if the dollar collapses, what happens? I don't know. This is, again, outside of my purview. So, salvation by the effects of all, a collectivism, this idea of, well, together we can solve climate change. Well, I mean, coal, there's a war on coal, according to people who are living in states and counties where they produce coal. They say we can't open up anything new, we can't get any permits. to do this. For me, the idea of looking at the science of climate change, I want to know if, one, is the temperature changing? That any living thing or any dynamic thing has variation. Okay, so what is just normal variation versus actual change? That's one question I'd have. The other is, are humans, if there is change, are humans causing it? Is it the sun? Is it a volcano? Various things that can create change in climate. And then, if indeed there is change and humans are causing it, is it lethal? Will it cause humans to die off? If you don't have yes to all three, forget it. I don't think it's worth destroying an economy for something that is, in a sense, non-important. If we're all going to survive, well, then what's the point? Now, certainly, there's those who are talk that way. Then it's like, well, you want us to live where you can't see downtown LA anymore. You want to, to be those type who say, I don't trust air I can't see. No. Who wants to go back to those days? But, we have this perception right now that this is parents raising their kids, the most dangerous time. All these pedophiles out there. And I'm convinced there's no more, we don't have more pedophiles than we had in the 50s. We just know about them. The percentage is the same. There were just as many pedophiles, and our parents let us go out and say, hey, when it gets dark, get home. Right? We go off with our, what are you going to do? Or we're playing baseball. I wanted to play softball all the time. That's all I want to do. So a group of kids running around with baseball bats. You could kill somebody with that thing. But we managed not to kill anybody. Didn't even kill the ball most of the time. But, trying to just play and have fun out there is too dangerous. The idea that a parent is neglectful if they don't have their child in their eyesight at all times is, we live in a state of anxiety, perpetual anxiety that is unfounded. A time of limited natural resources. We're going to run out. We're going to run out of oil. We're going to run out of coal, and yet we keep finding more. If you go back 30 years, they said, here's how much oil we have. Well, we're still at the same level. We've been using it for 30 years. We've still got the same amount. It's the amount that is discovered and we can get to, but there's all this other that's there. That calling it a, the idea that it's a limited or a fossil fuel is, again, it's an ideology that's going to put that on there. There's some debate whether or not decaying dinosaurs and plants is what makes oil anyway. Okay, that's all. And animal rights. Do animals have the same rights as you? Now, if you don't believe in a creator and that we all evolved at the same time, well then, yeah. Why wouldn't they? Who do you think you are? Just evolved up where you could talk and make laws and have governments and all that stuff.
Yeah, but why would animals have shelters and humans don't?
We have shelters.
No, some don't.
Well, some people don't have shelters. Yeah, I understand that. I was talking to a gal the other day. She was very upset that her mother was living in a tent. She said, my mother lives in a tent. She's homeless.
Or in cars.
And I said, she's not homeless. She has a home. It's a tent. She's addressless. She doesn't have an address. Well, that is maybe a distinction that isn't worth anything. But, how much is choice versus non-choice? And how do we allow people to live with their choices but be prepared to assist them? I know a family, if they keep funding somebody who's living irresponsibly, they will drain their family resources. Totally drain their family resources for no gain. There's documented cases of family going through $10 million. Well, this was in Britain, so it was 10 million pounds on one addict who was still an addict at the end of it. That's a lot of dough. Okay, let's see what we have. This is just one example of what I thought was fundamentalism on the left. We think of fundamentalism as only on the right, typically. So I thought, well, are there fundamentalists on the left? I think so. And so here's Gary Harrington. He is sentenced to 30 days for catching rainwater on his own property. This is from this year. And it's an application of a 1925 law being enforced by state water managers. It's like, what, you can't catch your own water anymore? And again, this whole discussion of what is yours versus not yours. When does the state say we have a vested interest in what's on your property and we're going to tell you what you can and can't do on it? You know, if what you're doing on your property is impacting somebody else, clearly, but it's like this isn't as clear cut as we like to think sometimes. And certainly that's why we have courts and laws and we have ways of discussing, but having a way of discussing it without saying, well, there's only one way to think about this. Okay. And the idea that we would preserve property rights at all costs before we start imposing some other concern on it. This last summer we had an opportunity as a family to travel. My daughter plays an oboe and she's in a traveling chamber orchestra. And they were invited to play at the Olympics. And she actually was on the main stage at Hyde Park. I say proudly of my daughter and her group. But our tour guide, he was Austrian. And we were dialoguing. I saw things fairly differently than he did. And we had a lively discussion about it. And he says, well, I don't want you polluting my air. It's like, oh, okay, well, I don't want to pollute your air either, but I don't want your policies to destroy my economy. Okay, how do we balance these things out? We're looking at great amounts of money in the last few years going into solar and wind and other ways of generating energy. And what are we getting in return? Can we just ask the question? The idea of being able to challenge it at all becomes now you're anti-science. Well, clearly the planet is going to die unless we do something, and we have to do it now, and you're in the way. Okay, so I did put 2 resources. If you're interested in those who have conservative ideas and you say, yeah, I don't want to go through all this stuff, 2 books, these 2 books would give you, this is what conservatives think. This is where it's coming from. Both recent, Dennis Prager and Mark Levin are, they're conservative. The Tea Party is all about saying, let's go back to our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, and let's follow that as closely as we can. That this is a contract from our founders to the citizens of today. So the question is, should we go back to slavery or having women without a vote? There's nobody that I know of in the Tea Party movement, and I don't know lots of people there. I'm not some luminary in the Tea Party. That nobody is saying we want to go back to slavery and no voting rights for women. Well, women's voting is part of our Constitution, right? Really we're not. Well, yes, we've changed it, and our founders were opposed to slavery.
Yeah, they were.
Hamilton was a huge. He started the Manumission Society of New York, and others are saying we need to adhere to the principles that made this country great, in order to ensure it being great when we pass it along to the next generation. Those are 2 competing ideas. That's what motivates conservatives is the Constitution. That's what's being read widely in conservative circles, not Ayn Rand. The Constitution. The idea that Dennis Prager and Mark Levin are not radical. If you were to call in with leftist ideas to Mark Levin, he's an entertainer. Talk radio is entertainment. And he will entertain certain ones by not showing a whole lot of respect for leftist ideas. I mean, that's what he does. Because Americanism is quite different than socialism. It's quite different. That, let me just, in terms of happiness, there's many studies here in this country, the studies on happiness, conservatives rate higher on the scales of happiness than liberals do. Always. It's always, and that's been over time. And being able to look and say, well, why would they be happier? And should, if people are happier when they are involved in a religion, should therapists who are involved in helping people be happy not be so passive when it comes to encouraging people into their religion.